right, so I'm Jade, Werner, and I'm just going to be speaking briefly. Actually, most of the time is going to be devoted to Christina and Faheem presenting their projects that they did for my course. But just briefly, I wanted to give some context for the course that I developed, Digital Victorians, which was a 300 level undergraduate English course. Wait one moment just while I get this started. Okay. All right, so I got it. All right, so in his instructive chapter, How Not to Teach the Digital Humanities, Ryan Cordell cautions against using the term digital humanities in undergraduate classrooms. Far from signaling, he says, far from signaling our cutting-edge research and teaching, I suspect that the phrase digital humanities often raises perfectly valid worries with our students, many of whom have spent their entire educational careers sleepwalking through ed tech nightmares. Here then, Cordell relocates profound anxiety, not among DH scholars concerned about the validity or institutional understanding of their research and pedagogy. Instead, Cordell alerts us to anxiety on the parts of our students. Valid worries regarding the seeming creeping dystopianism which has accompanied the growth of digital technologies, the disruption of their education as a result of blind enthusiasm for the next big thing in the classroom. And what Cordell goes on to note, my own experiences have confirmed. Many of our students, honestly, truly, really choose literature, history, or art history, or religious studies because they want to read and think deeply rather than follow what they perceive as a more instrumentalist education. I would add, too, that our students are not exactly digital natives, despite the popularity of the moniker with which they've been saddled. Indeed, despite their undoubted familiarity with social media, computers, word processing programs, and so on, I think a lot of students actually see a class marked with digital and feel deeply anxious that they lack key skills to take such a class. And I know I would feel exactly the same way. I often feel actually the same way, like standing in front of you today, acting as though I know what the digital humanities are, right? So I have taken Ryan Cordell's words very much to heart. Without retreating from opportunities, the new ways of thinking presented by digital methods, I've tried to consider what would it mean to create a DH course only minimally centered on the digital. How do I create a DH classroom with a low bar of entry in terms of computing skills, which naturally extends rather than breaks from literary work as we and our students know it? How do I create a DH classroom, to return to Cordell's call to action, that integrates DH into the undergraduate curriculum as a naturalized part of what literary scholars or historians or other humanists do? So my resulting course was called Digital Victorians. I created a syllabus which primarily focused on the history of the uses and meanings of literary criticism. Reading Matthew Arnold, William Wordsworth, George Eliot, Oscar Wilde, alongside Michel Foucault, Terry Eagleton, Adam Gopnik, just to throw in some New Yorker articles, we asked, what is the point of literary criticism? What is it good for? And if it's worth anything, how should it be taught? What methods of reading support a robust, meaningful practice of literary criticism, whatever that may be? We then used an assortment of user-friendly free computing tools to help us further and advance these key questions. The end result, I hoped, wouldn't be that students primarily come away with feeling they had learned new computing skills and could therefore only now that they've taken this class, create digital projects. Though, as you'll see in a moment, my students really did come up with some really brilliant projects that I'm very, very proud of. I'm so proud of you. Okay, so instead, I'm just some screenshots of the questions we explored in our class and some of the different projects that we were doing. So instead, I hope that my students would feel empowered in realizing that in choosing a humanities education, an education fundamentally centered on questions of why rather than how, they already had the necessary skill set to pursue and make meaningful works of digitally based literary criticism, right? So that they're not picking, it's not like, oh, this course will give you these skills. It's that, no, you already have these skills. You already can do this, right? So, yeah, I just wanted to mention quickly some of the points of inspiration, right? Like, because this course, you've probably heard variations of this spiel before from a lot of different scholars. And so I just wanted to say, like, I'm so indebted to the other scholars who are thinking in these veins. Rachel Sagner-Verma's work alerted me to the creative and scholarly possibilities of examining indexing, a non-digital form of information organization, alongside text analysis tools. Paul Fife taught me how not to read the Victorian novel, which we played around with. Stephen Ramsey inspired me to embrace screwing around as fundamental to humanities inquiry. So that was my rationale behind my course. But to give you a better sense of anti-anxiety DH, and even somewhat my non-DH, DH class, I turned the rest of my time over to two students from Digital Victorians who took it in fall 2018, just this past year, Christina Smith and Faheem Dyer. So, go ahead, Christina. And I'm going to give it to you.
Yes. I'm currently battling allergies, so I'm bringing my trusty package of tissues with me. If I sneeze, I apologize. So, hello. I'm Christina Smith. Thank you for the introduction. I'm a recently graduated senior from Wheaton, a double major in film and new media studies and creative writing and literature. I participated in both the Digital Victorians course and the course that Professor Shaw was describing, but I'm going to focus more on the project that I did for Professor Werner's class. So with that, I'm going to be talking about my final project for the course. The assignment prompt was this a bit open-ended and encouraged us to really experiment using digital tools that we had been working with in class. And we were tasked to create some sort of visualization or other creative imagining of a Victorian novel or series. So I chose to do a guided surface reading of the 4 Sherlock Holmes novels, and I embedded that analysis into a WordPress website, just because it was a platform that I was very familiar with. I came to that because we had read A Study in Scarlet earlier in the semester, and it was already a canon I was pretty familiar with. It has its advantages when being input into these sorts of text analysis tools, since it's a distinct canon within Victorian literature and published within a pretty close time frame, the first novel being published in 1887 and the last being in 1915. So with that, I conducted my analysis using Voyant, which is an online text analysis visualization tool, and I would take certain graphs and visualizations from that tool and embed them into the site and link to them. The Interact with this visualization link you'll see under there, that would link to a other platform. So again, we were tasked to read A Study in Scarlet earlier in the semester and input it as a plain text file into Voyant. And this excerpt in particular marks the first trend that prompted some questions on my part and made me want to go a bit deeper into the Holmes novels. I noticed that the frequency of the word Watson, interestingly, only occurs 9 times in A Study in Scarlet. But then it jumps dramatically later in the series from 24 times in The Sign of 4 to 114 times in The Hound of the Baskervilles. And it kind of drops off a bit in The Valley of Fear. But that curve was very interesting to me, and the frequent words sort of tab was very interesting to me. And I wanted to see how Watson's role as a narrator kind of characterized him as an active or passive person through these frequent words. So taking a further step back, this is what a dashboard looks like for Voyant. You can see there's all sorts of different panels that you can take some analysis from, and it can be a bit daunting to look at, I know. When I was first introduced to it, I was like, oh, it looks very pretty, but what does this mean? I was, though, able to focus on my specific interest in the prominent words used across the 4 novels, especially with the word cloud shown at the top left. I was able to note that the words said, Holmes, and man were among the most common words used in all 4 novels. So that brought up even more questions about my activity-passivity dynamic between Holmes and Watson as characters. So that made me question who is talking the most. Does man often refer to a singular person, and is that person Holmes, or is it just a story with a lot of men? Could be both. What does this say about Watson considering his role as a narrator, and is looking at frequent words even consequential in determining character dynamics within the series? So in taking a further step back and addressing more of that anxious feeling of, oh, what does all this mean? I went into this project, understandably, with a lot of questions, and came to understand that questioning was the most distinct part of the process. Professor Werner mentioned that she used Paul Fife's pedagogy in class, and I think it captures the nature of this project and of digital humanities research in general. He encouraged an interrogative stance among his students and acknowledged that his students were quite frustrated when assigned not to read a Victorian novel, but rather conduct a surface reading like I was doing. So he questioned, how do you teach students to accept a condition of not knowing and to embrace that interrogative stance as a grounds of inquiry and of research? And I think there are two ways that I tried to incorporate an answer to that question into my project. So the first strategy was to acknowledge from the get-go that this is a process founded on questioning. I incorporated a questions rot section at the end of each page of analysis and basically summarized the analysis I conducted on that particular page, as well as ask some questions that would guide my analysis on the next ones. I found it interesting that I even came to question the nature of my search more frequently as I got closer to the last page. You'll notice it's kind of hard to read, I apologize. But the third one right here, my last question was just, what is the value of searching through character dialogue in order to parse out activity versus passivity? Is querying the words said even the most effective way to do this? So this act of incorporating my questions into my project helped visualize the idea that this website wasn't a typical research assignment that I had come to acknowledge as a humanities student, and it helped alleviate that sense of anxiety of, like, I need to prove a thesis, I need to have a concrete answer to all of these. So with that, my second strategy, or a second strategy that the course addressed about answering Paul Fife's question, was that it emphasized early on that this is a process founded on questioning rather than answers. We were assigned to read the Ramsey source, the Hermeneutics of Screwing Around, and the Fife source, How Not to Read a Victorian Novel, towards the start of the semester. I took a screenshot from the online syllabus for Paul Fife's source, and we read it in early October. So, and this project was completed towards end of November, early December. This again helped alleviate some sense of anxiety in that I wasn't thrown off by the fact that I may not have a concrete proven thesis by the end of this project, and that was okay, and that the real experience of this, at the risk of sounding kind of cheesy, was and is the process of asking questions and this sense of exploration and browsing. And with that, I need to blow my nose. My goodness. So with that said, I realized that I wouldn't get answers to every question that I had. For example, I was really focusing at one point on this correlation between the words said and man. And I just kept interrogating that, and there was a very strong link between those two words, but I couldn't find a link between the phrase the man said or said the man, and I wasn't sure entirely where that link came from. But I realized that I could possibly answer that question with a closer reading of the four novels if I went in and tracked how often the words man and said were used in conjunction with one another and possibly find an answer. But then I realized I wouldn't have known to look for that trend if I hadn't conducted my surface reading in the first place. So that just goes to show that closed and surface reading have this complementary practice, and that, yes, while some questions will remain unanswered, that desire still is valid, and this process is an ongoing sort of bit of research. And again, that anxiety to prove a thesis still surfaced on a narrower scale. I frequently return to the idea of the active versus passive nature of Watson. And again, it's a central question that didn't really prove to have an answer at first glance. But through my system of questioning, I was able to come to a point about his questioning itself. I noticed that Watson often takes this interrogative stance throughout his investigation. Investigations with Holmes. He frequently asks, like, how did you do this? Like, how did you come to that conclusion? He's amazed, he's shocked. And that kind of proves his investment in the investigative process in the first place. So that led me to wonder, can the interrogative stance itself provide an answer? So to kind of wrap things up and to echo Professor Werner's opening comments, questioning really is the most naturalized part of this digital humanities research process. Both Watson and I wanted answers. Watson's like, you've left these things unexplained. And I'm like, I've left these things unexplained. And yes, again, some of my questions may have been better answered by performing close readings, but this process also deepened my understanding of the Holmes novels in an interesting way. And the fact, and it helped me to understand that the interrogative stance that Fife defines is a key element to both criminal investigations in the Victorian era, as well as in conducting digital humanities research in the present day. So while digital humanities research may leave some points unexplained, like what became of the hound when its master was in London, I came to understand that there's something to be said of this process of inquiry as being vital to an understanding of literature as closer analysis. So, yeah, thank you. I turn it over to Faheem.
Hi, I'm Faheem, English major, American Studies major, also a student of Dr. Werner, and I also took this Digital Victorians class, and I'm also going to be talking about my final project for that class. So from my perspective, Dr. Werner's stated goal of applying humanities frameworks and processes to unconventional tools was resoundingly successful. It came through strongly in material and exercises that were assigned to the class, but it also became sort of naturally how we participated in the class, how we worked autonomously. And all the key insights that I kept, and I would say honestly continue to return to throughout the class, stem from a foundational truth, or what came to me as a foundational truth of the course, and that is a breadth of tools is never anything but an asset to the right inquiry, right? Within the traditional humanities, that looks like the application of as many critical frameworks and theories is useful. And between disciplines, that's the employment of as many strategies and methodologies as may seem even potentially compelling. In just a few words, it's screwing around, as laid out very eloquently by Stephen Ramsey. What can you do? What can you make stick by applying your basic ideas and inclinations as a humanist to any and all tools at your disposal? That was a philosophy that became central to how I approached Werner's class. I see in hindsight, not unintentionally, and it was the core motivation behind how I designed my final projects, whose conception I am here to talk about. So, one project from sort of earlier in the semester was indexing Elizabeth Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese, which was, a collection of 44 sonnets. And our edition already had an index, but each class member was encouraged to make their own out of concepts and terms that we thought were underexplored in the index provided. And then we also sort of shared and added to each other's in Google Drive. And that exercise reaffirmed to me that indexing is itself a form of analysis, and analysis is as much a creative and interactive process as it is anything else. And indexing as an interpretive, representative, and creative sort of undertaking in its own right became sort of the silhouette for my final project, which was taking indexing as the bones of something more overtly creative. You can see my index over here. It's a little bit low res. So our final was information artistry. We were tasked with, to use some vocabulary from the syllabus, developing a piece of, again, information artistry of whatever kind struck our fancy, an aesthetically impactful work of criticism. My indexing project immediately sort of jumped out at me as good fodder for development because it was something that felt like material from the class that was very artistically malleable and already conceptually lush, right? It's 44 sonnets full of allusions and imagery and concepts of their own, but they've been distilled into discrete, easily transferable data points, right? Which is what index essentially is. So with the sensibilities instilled in me by the content of the class in mind and a radically open-ended mandate for a final project, a consideration of any and all, even tangentially related interests of mine led me to music. I have basic, really amateurish familiarity with music composition and mixing software like FL Studio or Fruity Loops, which is what it's colloquially called. And I was determined, or I became determined, to marry its use with that of my index of sonnets of the Portuguese. So I resolved that I would take the 44 sonnets that make up Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese and use Fruity Loops to make them somehow into music by way of 5 index headings that I assembled for my previous index project. So in turn, can you guys see that? It doesn't really matter, actually. Yeah, in turning the sonnets from the Portuguese into music, I watched them over the course of the project go through what are to me 4 distinct phases of transfer. For my indexing project, like the original post-midterms undertaking, I indexed 5 distinct terms and concepts, marking the sonnet and line number in which there was an instance of each. The index headings I cataloged are heaven, God, music, regality and titles of nobility, and classical myths and stories. So the poems become an index. You can't read that, but it's... by charting these 5 ideas, as they were introduced and developed over the progression of the text, I took 5 key ideas from 44 poems of 14 lines each and distilled them into 1 page of data, hard numbers that on their own might tell the story of Browning's work differently than a close reading would on its own. So the text as data also in a way compressed the ideas, made them more readily applicable to more forms, perfect for reworking into new art. One such way that might be accomplished is by tracking them in visual space. That's Fruity Loops down there. I am not a musician or a music theorist. I have no talent or skill in that area. So my work with Fruity Loops was built out of a purely service level understanding of the software, sort of a visual and tactile one. I mess around and I play with things and I see what sounds they make on the other end. Notes, beats, and measures only present themselves to me in any decipherable way as objects that can be manipulated in a physical sphere. That is how the index became sound. I found in the visual sphere 44 blocks, each block 1 sonnet of continuous time, inside of which 5 different musical phrases, the index headings, could slowly evolve. So the ultimate form of the project was a song, 44 measures at 120 beats per minute, through each measure 5 different instrumental sections corresponding to their own index headings that in the measure whose sonnet had another instance of that heading would play a more complex phrase. Does that make sense? Is it clear? Okay. Yeah, so I started with sonnets from the Portuguese and came out the other side with a piece of music, as you can see laid out in detail here. But in the grand sweep, I have an evolution of the same 5 core concepts, right? They go from text to data to image to sound. And each evolution only exists because of the component parts of the previous iteration and exposure to new tools. Despite how different it appears at the end, it is still, in essence, the same material, just filtered through a new creative exercise, a profound demonstration of the power of DH, and I just happened to stumble upon it by poking around and throwing stuff at the wall. Do you guys want to hear it, or should we? So this is, you're going to see the software and you're going to hear the music. And it just sort of cuts off because I don't, I'm again, not a music theorist, but that was sonnets from the Portuguese. And I think that's all I have, but that was the project.